now. So I just want to take a minute to introduce our amazing PhD alum and current postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, Richmond Wong, who is delivering a talk on his dissertation. And this is sort of a victory lap for our PhD students or PhDs, completed PhDs, once they finish the dissertation, as a sort of like celebration of what they have accomplished, and a moment that they get to share all of the work that they've spent years, agonizing over, and they get to share the fruits of their labor with us. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Richmond presenting his dissertation talk, Values by Design Imaginaries, Exploring Values Work in UX Practice. Take it away, Richmond.
Great, thank you, Anessa. Let's see, start sharing the screen. I think that should be, is that working? Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. I'm very happy to be returning to the iSchool for this talk. And this talk is on my dissertation titled Values by Design Imaginaries. And it's really about the different types of relationships and practices that connect technology design with consideration of ethics and social values. And so first I want to start with just a brief vignette reflecting on my own experiences that helped motivate this research. My entry point to thinking about the relationship between values and design started with privacy. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was concerned about potential privacy concerns posed by new technologies like Google Glass. And I was excited to hear about a growing movement called privacy by design. The idea that privacy protection should be embedded into products and organizational practice during the design of products. And privacy by design has been put forward in regulatory guidance from the US and other countries and by the recent European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. Yet, as I came to learn, these requirements to enact privacy by design don't actually provide a lot of guidance about what privacy by design means in practice or what the relationship is between privacy and design. And while this community had a deep recognition of the complexities of privacy, the discussion of design seemed much less complex. I had assumed that privacy by design meant applying a rich set of design approaches towards privacy initiatives, such as the design practices I was familiar with from my background in the field of human-computer interaction, things like user-centered design, value-sensitive design, speculative design, and so forth. However, in these privacy by design discussions, design seemed to be used rather narrowly as either a way to implement the law, via compliance engineering, or to solve specific privacy problems. Design was framed as a deductive way to solve a problem using approaches such as encryption methods or building a system to comply with the fair information practices. And these are all very important privacy initiatives, but I kept finding myself asking, where is the rest of design? Where is the kind of inductive, exploratory, and forward-looking aspects of design? There are other ways that design can relate to social values like privacy in ways that are not just about problem solving. And so these experiences led me to ask 2 research questions in my dissertation. One, how can design methods build on existing practices to promote a more reflexive practice around values and design? So in other words, how can we use design to consider ethics and values and do so in ways that are not just focused on deductive problem solving? But then if we think that design is a site and method through which we can address values issues, the next question is then, who is responsible for doing that kind of work? And so that leads to question 2, how do user experience professionals or UX professionals who are working within technology companies attempt to surface and address values issues in their work practices? To answer these questions, I used design-based research methods to propose new methods and practices that use design to prompt consideration of values. And I use qualitative methods involving interviews and observations to understand how UX professionals address values and ethics in their work. So today I'll start by giving a little background, then talk about the first project that used design fiction workbooks to explore privacy issues. Then I'll move into the second longer project studying how UX professionals address values in their work, and then provide some concluding thoughts. So first, I want to highlight just a couple grounding concepts and terms that I use throughout. I refer a lot to values in design, and values in design refers to an interdisciplinary set of research, which is broadly interested in how technological artifacts promote or embed social values and how technology designers' practices and beliefs affect these artifacts. So kind of as a basis, technologies are not neutral tools. For example, Langdon Winter discusses how in the US before the 1970s, the design of sidewalk curbs and building entrance stairs made it difficult or impossible for people with limited mobility to move about freely, excluding them from public life. Even if these buildings were not designed to be discriminatory, that was the effect that they were having. And by redesigning infrastructure with things like curb cutouts, ramps, and elevators, it changed the values in politics being promoted by these buildings and built infrastructures. And so this leads to the argument that technical artifacts, whether they be ramps or pieces of software, are not just neutral tools, but have values in politics. And by politics, we don't mean liberal or conservative, but rather that technical artifacts help promote certain configurations of social order. So in the case of the stairs, they allow access to some while making it difficult to others. I use the term social values to refer to conceptions of what is good, proper, important, or desirable in human life. And while sometimes we might think about broadly shared commitments to certain values, like the UN Declaration on Human Rights, my project focuses on how values arise as a part of situated experiences. Values can come from a variety of sources. We might talk about an individual's values, values that come from social norms, values expressed in technical artifacts, expressed in the law, and so forth. Moreover, I use Nassim Parvin et al.'s view of values as hypotheses. So I'm interested in how people use values as a lens for describing and understanding their own practices, such as how participants might use privacy as a lens to interpret a set of conceptual designs, or how UX professionals might use values as a lens to advance certain actions within their companies. So my dissertation suggests new design practices to elicit discussion of values, such as privacy, by using design fiction. And second, this work starts to understand the practices of UX professionals who address values as a part of their work. The first project investigates how design can be used to help prompt useful discussion about social values and social implications of technology, specifically focusing on privacy. With collaborators Ellen Van Wyk, James Pierce, John Chuang, and Deirdre Mulligan, we created a set of provocative conceptual designs called design fictions to explore privacy issues around emerging biosensing technologies, or technologies that sense human bodies. And then we use these designs to help elicit discussions about privacy with participants. So when I was doing this research around 2016, a new range of mobile consumer biosensing technologies were being announced and produced. Technologies that sense data about human bodies in different ways, including so-called smartwatches, smart bands, smart speakers, smart cameras, and other internet-connected sensing devices. These might include cameras, microphones, thermal sensing, or other sensors, and could apply analytical algorithms to infer information about kind of object detection or physiological signals, for instance. And one of the concerns was that these new technologies present new types of privacy concerns, but due to the new forms of data collection or their deployment into new contexts, it's not really clear what kinds of issues related to privacy might emerge. A lot of privacy approaches, like privacy impact assessments, are deductive, checklist-based, and broadly assume that the problems of privacy are already known and well-defined in advance, which isn't the case with this group of technologies. So this project aimed to use design approaches to help explore the new problem spaces of privacy in inductive, situated, and contextual ways. So often colloquially, we'll think about design as a way to solve problems. But in this case, we wanted to use design as a way to inquire, as a form of inductive exploration. Design here is not about solving an immediate problem, but rather engaging participants in design activities as a mode of inquiry to better understand what privacy means to certain people in certain situations. So kind of how do people's reactions to these designs help us understand how they see and experience the world of privacy? And to do this, we created a design workbook of design fictions. So workbooks are collections of conceptual designs that allow designers to explore and reflect on a design space. And design fiction is a practice using design to ask social questions by creating conceptual designs or artifacts that help create and suggest a fictional world. So sort of similar to how speculative fiction or science fiction would use text to create a fictional world to ask questions about social issues. Design fiction does a similar thing, but through the design of artifacts. And rather than finding design solutions for privacy, we wanted to use design fiction as a way to help explore the problem space of what privacy might look like with these emerging biosensing technologies. So I worked with Ellen Van Wyk and James Pierce to create a design workbook to do this exploration and reflection. Inspired by technical research, science fiction, including the Dave Eggers novel, The Circle, and trends from the technology industry, we created a couple dozen fictional products, interfaces, and kind of web pages of biosensing technologies. And these included kind of smart camera-enabled neighborhood watch systems, advanced surveillance systems, implantable tracking devices, and remote sensors that can detect people's heart rates. And these were created as part of a self-reflective exercise for us as design researchers to explore the problem space of privacy. So I'll go through a couple examples of these designs, which are intentionally provocative or intentionally problematic. This design depicts an imagined surveillance system for public spaces like airports that automatically assigns threat statuses to people by color coding them. Now we left it in ambiguous intentionally about how the design makes these color coding determinations to try to invite questions about how the system classifies people. And it also does this move that certain technologies will make, saying that, because we cover up faces, therefore, this is not, privacy is not an issue here because you can't identify people. Another example is this. We began to iterate on ideas relating to tracking implants and the different types of social contexts they could be used in. So this scenario advertises a workplace implantable tracking device called TrueWork, where employers can subscribe to the service, make their employees implant these devices and keep track of their whereabouts and work activities to improve efficiency. And we also reimagined that implant as a product called CoupleTrack, an implantable tracking chip for couples to use and share information with each other. So rather than prescribe a single definition of privacy, these designs helped us explore a range of questions about how privacy could be conceptualized, building on Deirdre Mulligan et al.'s work on privacy as an essentially contested concept. In each fictional interface or product, we can ask questions like, why is privacy important? Is it about protecting data or anonymity or dignity? Who is getting protected by privacy? Is it an individual, an employee, a couple, a group? Who and what violates privacy? And what are the consequences? Is it the government, an employer, a service provider? How is privacy provided? Perhaps privacy is given through a technical design solution. Perhaps privacy is provided by a law. And where and when is the context where privacy applies? And so this helped us interrogate and reflect on privacy as a socio-technical concept and see privacy as varying across different contexts of use. But moreover, we wanted to know how non-researchers, particularly technology practitioners, might discuss privacy in relation to these conceptual designs. We conducted an interview study recruiting 10 graduate students who were training to go into technology professions, most of whom had some prior tech industry experience. We gave them a physical copy of the designs and explained that the designs were conceptual, but didn't tell them that the designs were initially made to think about privacy issues. And we found that participants centered values in their discussions when looking at the designs, predominantly discussing privacy, but also related values such as trust, fairness, security, and due process. There are a lot of themes, but I'll highlight 3 of them today. Participants imagined the designs as real, they saw themselves as multiple users, and they saw themselves as technology practitioners when talking about these designs. So even though participants were aware that the designs were imagined, some imagined the designs as seemingly real by thinking about things like long-term effects in the fictional world of the design. So this product is an easily hideable, wearable, battery-powered live streaming HD camera. And one participant imagined what could happen to social norms if these became widely adopted, saying, quote, "If anyone can have it, then the definition of wrongdoing would be questioned, would be scrutinized." Here he's suggesting that previously unmonitored activities would become opened for surveillance and tracking. So he says something like, quote, "Are the nannies picking up my children at the right time or not? The definition of wrongdoing will be challenged." Participants in reacting to these became actively involved in fleshing out and creating the worlds in which these designs might exist. And this reflection also speaks to a consideration of some of the secondary implications of widespread adoption, highlighting potential changes in social norms with increasing forms of surveillance. Second, participants took on multiple user subject positions in relation to the designs. So one participant read this webpage for True Work and laughed at the design's claim that it would create a happier and more efficient workplace, saying, quote, "This is again positioned to the person who would be doing the tracking, not the person who would be tracked." And she notes that the website is really aimed at the employer. She then imagines herself as an employee using the system, saying, quote, "If I called in sick to work, it shouldn't actually matter if I'm really sick. There's lots of reasons why I might not want to say, this is why I'm not coming to work." The idea that someone can check up on what I said, it's not fair. This participant put herself in both the viewpoint of an employer using the system as well as an employee using the system, bringing up issues of workplace surveillance and fairness. So participants saw values implications of the designs from different subject positions and different stakeholder viewpoints. Third, others looked at the designs through the lens of being a technology practitioner, relating the designs to their own professional and technical practices. So looking at this design that automatically flags and supposedly detects suspicious people, one participant reflected on his self-identification as a data scientist and the values implications of predicting criminal behavior with data when he said, quote, "The creepy thing, the bad thing is like, and I'm a data scientist, so it's probably bad for me too, but the data science is predicting like Minority Report." And then he goes on to half jokingly say, basically, you don't hire data scientists. But here there's an interesting reflection by this participant on how his practices as a data scientist might be implicated in this product's creepiness, that his initial propensity to want to use data to predict if subjects are criminals or not might not be a good way to approach this problem and have implications for values like due process. The designs led some participants to begin reflecting on privacy and values implications of their own technical practices. Given the workbook's ability to help elicit reflections on and discussion of privacy in multiple ways, this design method can be useful for addressing values in design and practice. The speculative workbooks helped open up discussion about values, similar to some of what Katie Shilton describes as values levers, or activities that foreground values and cause them to be viewed as relevant and useful to design. Participants looking at the designs from multiple subject positions evokes value-sensitive designs, foregrounding of multiple stakeholder perspectives. And participants reflected on the designs both from stakeholder subject positions and through the lens of their professional practices as technology practitioners in training. So overall, these design fictions brought attention to questions about potential socio-technical configurations and potential values and ethical issues of biosensing technologies. More specifically, with this project's focus on privacy, participants went beyond saying that privacy is important to think about. Instead, they began to grapple with specific, situated, and contextual aspects of privacy, such as considering different ways that we might create consent mechanisms for data collection, or noting different types of harms that might emerge when the same technology is used in different settings. At the same time, privacy professionals are looking for tools to help them look around corners, to help understand what types of new problems related to privacy might occur in emerging technologies and contexts. So rather than using top-down checklist-based approaches, which assume that concepts of privacy are well-known in advance, design fiction and speculative design practices can be particularly useful here, not to predict what will happen in the future, but to begin helping open up and exploring the space of possibilities. So that first project showed how design fiction could encourage situated and nuanced discussion of social values among technology practitioners in training. However, one of its limitations is that the interviews were done in a lab, and it raises questions about how technology professionals raise and address social values in their everyday work. So the second part of the dissertation provides insight into this question by studying user experience or UX professionals' practices as they relate to attempting to surface and address values and ethics as a part of their work. And I'd like to start with a brief vignette about an encounter I had with a UX professional. So in late 2018, I was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown San Francisco, and I was waiting to meet Francine, which is a pseudonym, who works on user experience at a company that creates enterprise software. In our discussion, Francine began to discuss an incident where she and some other coworkers learned that an organization that was a client of their company was involved in a way in perpetuating harms against migrant families. And that client organization reached out to ask for help to improve their installation of the software made by Francine's company. And Francine and a coworker had strong feelings against helping this client because of the harms they were causing. And they drafted a letter that they planned to share, noting how this violated their personal values. And while Francine felt that her immediate manager was supportive, the issue got raised to upper management. And Francine recounted the response back from a chief officer of the company as basically saying, do your job, and that not working for this client would open a can of worms. What if anyone could just stop work based on their personal values? In the end, the management of this company hired an outside contractor to help this particular client. And Francine had mixed feelings about that outcome. On one hand, she was glad that she didn't personally have to help this client, but at the same time was frustrated that it silenced the acknowledgement of problems that she and her coworkers saw. The goal wasn't about not working for the client, but to communicate the concerns they had about potential human rights violations, which got silenced. And so while the magnitude of potential harm in this situation is pretty high compared to a lot of other values and ethics issues, many interviewees recount instances when they tried to surface potential values issues, things involving things like privacy or accessibility, inclusivity, or just more generally trying to prevent harms to users. And sometimes they're partially successful, sometimes they're successful, and sometimes they're not successful. So the second half of the dissertation focuses on studying UX professionals and what I term values work, the practices and tactics that they employ in the name of addressing social values issues. This builds on Shilton, Gray, and Chivukula's research and others who have studied how technologists and UX professionals become aware of ethical issues in their work. And it builds on Shilton's concept of a values advocate, someone who tries to advocate for values during a design process. UX professionals present a kind of unique perspective among those involved in the production of technology by integrating consideration of technical and social factors in their work. So they have titles like user experience designer, user researcher, or interaction designer. Their jobs often include learning about and understanding the users of technologies and considering and advocating for those users' needs during the design of systems and products. And my research focuses on what happens after UX professionals see values as relevant to their work. How are these concerns then acted upon and addressed or not? What does doing this kind of values advocacy work look like? I also focus on practices within the boundaries of what the interviewees see as their everyday work. And so while things like formal tech worker activism and organizing were things that were occurring during this time period, they were not a focus of my study. I ended up talking with 12 UX professionals in North America from 6 organizations, mostly from the US. And these UX professionals all self-identified as trying to address values and ethical issues as a part of their work. I also conducted participant observations at Bay Area meetup events aimed at technology professionals who would discuss issues related to design, social values, and ethics. And the high-level takeaway from this part of the dissertation is that a lot of values work is not directly related to making changes in technical design, but instead is about trying to make changes to organizational culture organizational processes, and work practices. And a lot of this work is about navigating organizational power dynamics and organizational politics. And so there's a lot of practices that I talk about in the dissertation, but broadly, they fall into one of three goals or changes that UX professionals seek to make when trying to address values in their organization. One is to make more space for UX professionals to conduct values work. Two is making values visible and relevant to others in the organization. And three is changing organizational processes and organizational orientations towards values. For each of these kind of intended changes, there are several tactics that are used. And today I'll just go through and give kind of one example of a tactic for each of these types of changes. And then at the end, I will reflect on some of the partialness of these tactics in achieving their goals and opportunities and challenges of doing this work to try to address values and ethics from positions within companies. In addition, coming from my design research background, I also made use of design fiction during my research process, using design fiction as an analytical method, as a way to reflect on themes emerging from interviews and observations. So I'm going to intersperse those in the talk in what I'm calling 3 interludes, and kind of introduce these designs and talk about how they help us think about the themes arising in the qualitative work in some new ways. Okay, so one goal is to make more space for UX professionals to conduct values work within their existing work practices. So addressing values is not necessarily a formal part of the job description, but because their work involves thinking about how people will experience and interact with technologies, the UX professionals who I talked to discussed ways they try to incorporate consideration of values into their existing everyday practices. And one tactic here is to try to broaden who the user is in user research. User research is already an accepted practice within most technology companies, where researchers go and talk to people who might use the product in order to understand their needs. But user researchers can attempt to tactically expand and diversify who they include as users. This can help surface potential harms that might have differing impacts on different groups of users. So for example, Laura, a user researcher working for an educational software company, discussed trying to recognize and expand her interview pool to notice and include people from indigenous communities in the US. She says, quote, "But when I was talking about recruiting users from tribal colleges, even our product marketing person who does think we should care about people was like, yeah, but we can't make a marketing strategy specifically to them because there's not a large enough population of them to warrant us to spend that money." So while Laura wanted to include more research subjects from tribal colleges, she faced pushback from other stakeholders in her organization. Laura reflected that she knows that she works for a private company and that including people from tribal colleges in her research alone is not going to solve the problems of inequality and violence against Indigenous people in this country. But by including this group of users in her user research, Laura still hoped to work towards reducing harms to them. And one of the tactics that she tries to do in response to this is think about what other populations this group might align with the most so that she can try to make a convincing business case for studying them. And she suggests that thinking about rural students might be a way to meet the needs of this group. And so this is kind of an imperfect but tactical way to try to find support and make space for her values work. This tactic of broadening who the user is critiques and broadens the definition of who counts as a user, right? And tries to increase who gets accounted for in the design of technologies. But the critique that this tactic enacts is also partial because the category of user is held constant. In order to avoid causing harms to students from Indigenous communities, they have to become legible to the company as potential users of the product, and then their needs can be designed for. So diversifying who gets considered as a user can be useful towards promoting certain forms of inclusion and diversity, but it also promotes a particular relationship between people and technology, that of use. And this might hide some other types of relationships, such as the way that people might redesign or reappropriate or even reject technology systems. Okay, so this is the first design interlude. One assumption behind a tactic like this is that UX professionals have the agency to make decisions about, product design and who they consider in user research, which is not always the case, as Laura found out when she encountered resistance from a product marketing coworker. And so this design fiction explores that dynamic a bit. This design fiction is a poster that gets distributed within a fictional company called Face On AI Systems and is part of an internal values and ethics initiative. The poster says, as a designer, would you, and then has 12 statements highlighting potential harms. They start off seemingly innocuous, like design a package to look bigger on a shelf, working up to design an ad for a product whose frequent use could result in the user's death. And then at the end of the poster is this line, each of us is responsible for designing ethically. And after some time, an employee at this company uses a marker and rewrites parts of the poster, crossing out the starting line, as a designer would you, and replacing it with, as a company would we. And at the end, they cross out the each of us and replaces it with collective action. So the questions on this fictional poster are based on an essay by the real-life graphic designer Milton Glaser, sometimes called the Road to Hell questions. An interviewee who I talked to, Henry, mentioned using these questions to think about ethical dimensions of his own work. The Road to Hell questions seem like they could be useful provocations about how a designer might be implicated in the potential harms caused by a product. But these questions also place responsibility for making values decisions with individual designers who are assumed to have a lot of agency and decision-making power. And while this might be the case at a design firm, it is often not the case at a large technology company. The scribbled version of the poster imagines that an employee at the organization is making this critique, arguing that there's also a group or institutional responsibility for addressing these issues. While designers can try to make more space within their own work to address values, they also need to be able to convince other organizational stakeholders and decision makers. So that leads us to the second goal of values work, which involves UX professionals trying to get other people in their organization to see values and ethics as important and relevant to their own work. And one of these tactics is translating and making values visible to other organizational stakeholders. UX professionals generally do not have final decision-making power and need to translate and legitimize their values concerns to decision makers such as product managers. Brittany, who is a user researcher, discussed trying to promote her concerns about protecting the well-being of users of her company's enterprise software. So Brittany's company is incentivized to cater more to the needs of the enterprise client, while Brittany's job is to understand how end users or people who work for the client experience the system. Her own motivation comes from the fact that these workers don't choose to use this product. They're kind of forced to use it by their employers. And with that power imbalance, she wants to make sure that the features of the system protect the workers' needs as well as possible. But she notes that this reasoning won't convince her managers, and she needs to use business terms to make this issue visible and seem legitimate to other managers, describing problems in terms of financial or reputational risk. So for instance, Brittany said that she might argue her point by saying, quote, "We've already seen that we may get some negative feedback, negative press, negative social media on the small scale. If we roll this feature out more widely, it's a risk that we're going to get a lot more negative feedback. And what that means is that we're losing trust with these client companies. Trust has always been our number one value. And this is a significant reputational harm or reputational risk." So Brittany frames the problem as one of reputational risk for her organization in order to make the issue of worker well-being legible to product managers. Others reported making similar arguments in terms of reputational or financial risk to make their concerns legible. Laura, a senior UX researcher, tried another way to make values visible and legible to coworkers. She discussed creating an ethical debt tracker by using bug tracking tools. She keeps a list of the times that she wanted to add or change a feature that had some values implication, but was told that it could not be incorporated in the current release. She wants to have this record so that she can bring up those issues again in the future, trying to make these conversations visible and remembered over time. These rhetorical and framing tactics tactics can be really useful and powerful, but they're also potentially limited in that not all social values and ethical issues can be easily translated into this language of reputational risk, financial loss, or technical bugs. Okay, so in this design fiction interlude, I present the values and ethics work tracker, which is motivated by thinking about the experience of doing this work, of trying to make values visible to others in the organization. This imagined interface allows someone to track work tasks that they do related to values and ethics. So kind of each square at the top there represents a day, and darker squares indicate more contributions to values and ethics work. And here are the details for fictional user Jen, where she tracks things like attending a diversity and inclusion lunch, where she attempts to explain the non-neutrality of platforms several times, only to face rolled eyes and interruptions from a coworker. This design fiction helps reflect on the everyday work of surfacing values and how this labor is often invisible and unrecognized. The design fiction extends the accounts of interviewees by creating this interface that makes the type of labor they do more visible. The grid in the design fiction adapts a visualization used by GitHub that tracks a person's technical contributions to a project. Applying this model of tracking to values work begins to raise questions about the politics and implications of making values work visible in this way, which could be problematic in its own right. The use of representing values work through a visualization that was originally meant to track technical contributions was inspired by Laura's use of bug tracking software to try to track social and ethical issues. This design fiction was also inspired by a senior designer who discussed their uncompensated volunteer labor in furthering their company's diversity and inclusion initiatives. And they expressed frustration of having to repeatedly prompt team members to consider how product changes might create harms for end users. Another UX consultant described concerns about being seen as a Debbie Downer within the company because she keeps surfacing potential issues with products, even though that's a part of her job. And plus, during the time of research, as well as more recently, there have been cases of technology companies firing workers who strongly advocate for values and ethics. So there's labor in trying to manage how far one decides to push an issue. This design helped me reflect on aspects of invisible, emotional, and gendered labor in values work, which is reflected in the type of things that get tracked by the fictional user in this interface. Okay, so a third goal in values work involves UX professionals attempting to change processes and politics of the organizations that they work for. These practices try to change how their organizations conceptualize, address, or respond to values. One tactic here is when UX professionals tactically refer to corporate values and mission statements. Appeals to corporate values can help build alliances and coalitions with other organizational stakeholders. So for example, Brittany, a user researcher, describes that she can use her company's corporate value of equality as a way to start bringing in social justice topics in work conversations. Yet she notes that this requires negotiating what the value of equality means and how it should be interpreted. So other people in the organization don't necessarily see the same connection between the kind of corporate value of equality and issues of social justice in the way that Brittany does. In another example, Nova, a senior designer, discusses how their organization has created a big focus on values of diversity and inclusion, both in its products and in its workforce. And Nova discusses how these corporate values initiatives have given them space and license to do activities related to values, even if they're not necessarily the activities that the company anticipated its workers engaging in. So this includes holding gender education events, helping advocate for gender-neutral bathrooms, meeting with other workers in the company who volunteer for diversity and inclusion initiatives, talking about LGBT resources at both internal and customer-facing events. And Nova ties their ability to conduct these broad range of actions to the company's publicly stated commitments to diversity and inclusion. Nova describes this as, quote, "I feel it's given me a lot of leeway to be able to say, I'm acting in line with company principles. So, from the outside, we might look at some of these corporate value statements around equality or diversity or ethics as not being particularly useful or not having much weight. But, from positions within these large organizations, these values and principle statements can create some space within the company for workers like Brittany and Nova to contest and bring new interpretations of their company's values and principles. Also, tactical engagement with corporate values can help UX professionals get buy-in from other potentially more powerful decision makers in the organization by rhetorically aligning their work with their organization's stated goals. Okay. So this third design interlude reflects on some of the limits of those appeals to corporate values. These design fictions depict on the right, a Slack channel among a UX team at a fictional company called Intercube that creates sensing devices for buildings. And these workers become concerned about helping to design a new dashboard for a client that would help the client surveil its workers potentially without their knowledge or consent. And the workers try to appeal to their company's values of creating trust and creating human empathy with end users to try to dispute this project. But in an email, a VP at the company disputes this interpretation of those values, saying that they're also seeking to create trust and show empathy with the clients, not the end users. And in this story, ultimately, the VP ends up contracting the work out to an external consulting company that's willing to do this work. So this kind of contestation and reinterpretation of corporate values in this design fiction is meant to help consider what some of the limits might be of appealing to corporate values. The fictional story told through the designs also tries to represent some aspects of the experience that Francine described in the opening vignette to this section, when she discussed how her company ended up sending out controversial work tasks to a contractor. The shifting of, potentially ethically laden controversial work reflects concerns raised by Henry and Isabel. Both of these interviewees spoke about leaving or declining work offers with technology companies that they thought might be causing harms to end users, which left them in positions where they were kind of individually satisfied that the work that they were doing was not causing those harms. But then they also expressed concerns that it ultimately might not make much of a difference because someone else with a different set of personal values might take those jobs instead and do that work anyways. So I'm going to turn to a few reflections now. First, about the values work that these UX professionals are doing, and then to a few kind of meta reflections on design research methods. So first, doing this values work has effective dimensions. Trying to convince other organizational stakeholders that values are important often requires the emotional labor of performing niceness when surfacing these issues, even if the UX professionals are tired and frustrated of repeatedly voicing concerns to product teams and managers. In addition, interviewees discussed that having to repeatedly voice and legitimize concerns can also lead to exhaustion and fatigue. This draws some parallels to Sarah Ahmed's research on the politics of complaint. In part, Ahmed argues that speaking up to ask for changes can be labeled by listeners as complaint and dismissed. And listeners focus their attention on the speaker as problematic rather than attending to the problems that the speaker describes. And so sometimes a similar dynamic is at play with the UX professionals' values work. This labor is also gendered. So I don't claim that my sample is generalizable, but I think it's notable that 3/4 of my participants were female or non-binary, and UX work is often coded as feminine when compared to other forms of technical work. And this kind of suggests that the people engaging in values work may be those who are already underrepresented in the technology industry and may already be suffering other types of harms. I've also alluded to the partiality of these tactics. For instance, trying to expand who gets included as a user without contesting the category of user itself, or by trying to use financial risk framings to discuss values and ethics, even though that framing only works for certain issues. But from within these organizations and large corporations, to get traction on some of these values issues, it requires engaging in arguments that might be partial or not completely satisfactory, but might be successful in convincing a decision maker to make a better decision at a specific moment in time. This partiality is not done out of willful ignorance or kind of a lack of recognition of their partiality. Several interviewees discuss feeling ambivalent about engaging in these lines of argument. Nevertheless, these tactics represent attempts to change technology organizations from positions within and often from positions below, given that UX professionals are generally frontline workers rather than managers. And UX work and expertise is not always given the same prestige or legitimacy as other forms of technical work. So there's not really an idealized external position from which these workers can critique and enact change. They're trying to enact change from the positions that they're in. And these power dynamics, get reflected in interviewees' tensions between sometimes feeling kind of hopeful, like there's good opportunities, and sometimes feelings of skepticism about being able to enact this change. While they can succeed in creating some changes, there is also not a way to fully escape or transform the institutional and economic forces that are often working against them. At the same time, this partiality doesn't mean that these are ineffective practices. Values can emerge in a range of practices ranging from user research to advancing diversity and inclusion initiatives to making financial and business-oriented justifications for addressing values. And there's kind of a hopefulness here in that UX professionals are able to be flexible and take on different roles to enact this change, sometimes acting as a researcher, sometimes as an advocate or an educator, sometimes as a laborer, sometimes as a designer, and so forth. When thinking about ways we might try to create a values-based and ethical change at technology companies, we might consider these practices of values work from within as complementary to other ongoing legal, political, and community organization efforts from outside companies. I want to turn to a couple reflections on my use of design fiction in this project as well. So I use design fiction as a method of qualitative analysis, and kind of traditionally in qualitative analysis, the process of writing textual memos can help provide a step between collecting data and formal written analysis, helping the researcher reflect on and make sense of large amounts of qualitative data. Writing these memos allow a researcher to start closely in their data, abstract away from it, and then reflexively come back to their data with new ideas and insights. These design fiction interludes that I presented use design in a similar way to memo writing. And while traditionally design fictions often come from the imagination of its designers and creators, in this work I suggest that design fictions can also be created from qualitative empirical data and be used as a way to analyze and reflect on the data in a practice that I call design fiction memos. With design fiction memos, researchers can start close to their qualitative data, move away from it by creating and exploring a fictional world inspired by that data, and then the researcher can come back to their data with new insights. And design fiction memos can be created throughout the data collection and analysis process as a thinking tool. Design fiction memos can help researchers analyze and reflect on qualitative data in new ways that realize and extend the experiences recounted by participants through the creation of fictional artifacts that explore similar themes. And they also provide new ways to help circulate ethnographic accounts and stories. I also want to quickly reflect on the content of these design fiction memos. So a lot of design fiction projects, including the ones at the beginning of the talk, focus on depicting fictional products, like this kind of fictional Amazon page that I have. In contrast, the design fiction memos presented in the 3 interludes focus on depicting fictional organizations and practices rather than products. I call this orientation infrastructural speculations, using the lens of design to look at the politics and practices of institutions that are required to build and support technical products, rather than looking at just the product itself. I expand on this idea and work with collaborators Vera Holbenskaya, Sarah Fox, Nick Merrill, and Phoebe Sangers. But at its core, the idea is that we can be more attuned to issues related to power when we create design fictions and speculative scenarios that focus on practices and institutions of technology production and maintenance, and not just focusing on products and their use. Okay, so we've done a deep dive into these two projects. The first using design as a way to explore the problem space of privacy, and the second investigating what it means to work as a UX professional and try to do values work. I want to briefly mention the politics of what it means to choose design as a way to address values, whether that's using design as a speculative or provocative prompt, or engaging values from the perspective of a UX professional. Terms like values in design or privacy by design align with the popularity of design in the contemporary moment and recognizes the power of technical artifacts to promote and address values in multiple ways. At the same time, we should be reminded that design practices themselves are political. They present certain types of expertise, knowledge, and solutions as legitimate while obfuscating alternatives. What is considered a dominant or peripheral design practice can change over time too. And like Lily Irani and Crystal Sims have written a lot about these issues. So, I would say that design represents one approach to addressing values among many. Sometimes addressing values through design or from the positionality of a designer is going to be really impactful and really useful. And at other times, using kind of legal or economic or social or community-based approaches may be more appropriate than using design to address a values issue. And so this work has implications for different stakeholders involved in values in research and practice. For values and design researchers, the dissertation provides new ways to use design methods for studying values, both as a method of empirical inquiry and as a method of reflection and qualitative analysis. For HCI researchers and educators, a lot of our current design tools focus on thinking about ethics during the technical design process. But this research suggests that a lot of UX professionals' values work is political, organizational, and exists kind of outside of that technical design process. So we might think about moving away from values-centered design to values advocate-centered design, or have values advocate-centered design in addition to values-centered design in ways that can help support the social and organizational work. So for example, I've collaborated with Tanya Nguyen to develop timelines, a design activity creating scenarios, but this design activity is aimed at supporting the work of values advocacy. The fact that UX professionals don't often have decision-making power in their organizations also suggests that we need to consider these organizational and political and power contexts when designing new values and ethics design tools. Work by folks like Michael Medeo is starting to go in those directions. In addition to teaching technical skills to HCI students, we might also consider providing more education about social practices of UX professionals, such as how to navigate large bureaucratic structures. For UX professionals and values advocates, the tactics in the dissertation may help suggest points of intervention to discuss or address values and ethical issues, including things like finding opportunities to make business cases for ethical decisions, doing tactical user research, educating others in the organization, finding leverage points like company values, publicly stated commitments, standards or laws, and finding allies both within and outside of the organization. For formal ethics owners and managers, I think this work suggests finding ways to empower frontline workers who are already working on values and ethical issues, even if it's not a part of their official job duties, and for creating spaces and finding ways to make this type of values work legible, visible, as well as recognized and compensated. So my ongoing and future work advances the lines of research that are started in the dissertation, thinking about what does it mean to do the work of values in design, or what does it mean to do the work of ethics in design? And so I'm working on a collection of projects focusing on using design methods to prompt discussion on emerging values and ethics issues, as well as a collection of projects that focus on understanding design and UX professionals' values work, both what are their practices, as well as what are the social, organizational, and legal contexts that inform those practices. And the goal here is to help design methods for values and ethics and design practices around values and ethics help mutually inform each other. So thank you to my amazing advisor, Deirdre Mulligan, and my committee members, Jenna Burrell, John Chuang, and Gail DeKosnik. And thank you to the participants and interviewees who I talked to for sharing their time and experiences with me. A real assemblage of people and things are needed for work like this to be produced. Too many to be listed on screen, but a large thank you to all my collaborators, colleagues, supporters, friends, and everyone who helped make this work possible. I'm always happy to hear feedback or chat about these issues. My email is on screen, and I think we have some time for questions now too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Richmond. That was really wonderful. So yes, and I'll allow everyone some time to chat their varying applause and to fet you as appropriate. But I'll also let everybody know that if you have any questions, you have two options. You can raise your hand, in which case you will get called on, and you'll momentarily be unmuted and able to speak and ask your question to Richmond directly. Or you can type your question into the Q&A and Richmond will read it and answer it. So if you have questions, now is the time to do one of those two things. And so we can allow some time for people to formulate those questions.
So looks like there's a question here about kind of what next steps are for this work. And I think there's kind of a lot of different directions, and always looking for collaborators. So if people are interested in this stuff, let's chat, because I think there are a lot of different ways that this can go. Part of it, I think, is, how do we support UX professionals who are doing, who want to think about values and ethics, as a part of their work. And there might be many ways we can think about supporting them. It could be through the design of new toolkits. It could be about kind of forms of education and advocacy. It could be thinking about, are there new laws that help provide leverage points, right? One of the things I'm interested in now is, do new privacy laws, in California, we passed Prop 24, the California Privacy Rights Act. And does having kind of legislation like that allow for, workers who are concerned about issues like privacy to be able to have a leverage point to be able to say, it's not just my personal belief that, privacy is important, but there's this law that we have to follow. And so what are potential forms of leverage and intervention there? And then I'm also trying to think about ways to expand on the design methods. How can we use these kind of exploratory, inductive, speculative, and critical design methods in ways that are useful for design practice? So that's some of these, like, how can design be used as a form of qualitative data analysis? How can we use design to start raising questions about issues of power? And so that's kind of a set of things that I'm looking at right now, looking at kind of Internet of Things and always on surveilling technologies, but always happy to think about other domains as well. Let's see. Oh, okay, a lot of questions coming in. Let's see, I'll try to, like, a lot of these are kind of related, so I'll kind of talk more broadly about this. So one of the, right, so there are a lot of, one question here is about privacy opt-ins, things like having to check off the box, reading the long user agreements in terms of service. As part of the dissertation, I didn't perform a lot of research into that, but I've been involved in different projects where we have thought about what are different kind of mechanisms of consent and what are different ways of engaging with these documents. Especially we think about them more as design artifacts, right? So this is some work with James Pierce, Nick Merrill, and Sarah Fox. We thought about, often the terms of service and the privacy policy are thought about as long legal documents. What if we thought about these as artifacts to be designed? What types of different interactions could we have? So one thing was like, what do we create, like interactive booklets that you can print out and carry around and interact with as a different way of thinking about it. There's a large body of research around usable privacy and security that's thought about kind of other mechanisms to increase the usability of those mechanisms. Let's see. Right, so there's some questions here about different types of UX practices. So there are one question about UX professionals interacting with other teams like legal teams or auditing bodies. Another question about how have UX professionals done things like collective organizing and unionization, building worker power. I think, all of the above are great approaches, in addition to some of the more narrow design approaches to thinking about values. The studying worker organizing and unionization efforts was kind of scoped out of what I looked at in my dissertation, though it was like definitely going on in just like the context and the background of, when I was doing this research. I'm heartened to see that there's growing action there through groups like the Tech Workers Coalition and recent unionization efforts at Google and at other companies. And I think that, a lot of tools that we have for thinking about values kind of imagine a single, empowered designer, and like that's often not the case. And so, I think in parallel to the important social organizing work that's happening is kind of interfacing and seeing, are there ways that designing for worker collectives can be useful here too? And yes, one of the other tactics and practices that several interviewees talked about was trying to create interfaces with other teams. I don't think anyone I talked to specifically talked about interfacing with legal teams, but some did talk about, their companies having a privacy or accessibility or security team, and, talking specifically to those teams for those specific values. I'm trying to get leverage from, bringing in an expert in privacy or bringing in an expert in security into the product design process. Other people talked about, some of these large tech companies also have kind of internal research arms. And some people talked about trying to build connections with those researchers who could also serve as allies. And so, yeah, lots of potential ally finding both within and externally as well. Let's see. There's a question here from John Chuang about how some of these design methods and findings might be applicable to the AI field. And I'm not fully sure yet, but I think that there is I think there is kind of a way in there. And I think one thing that I'm interested in now is that there are a lot of these kind of toolkits for AI practice around kind of AI fairness or AI ethics. And there's research being done in this space around, what kind of values and ethics do these toolkits promote? Who do they envision as being empowered to make these changes? But I think that is potentially kind of one way to start thinking about how some of the design methods that I use in the dissertation might be applicable and useful in an AI context. And I do think that I would need to kind of reframe some of these, similar to the way that the UX practitioners I talk to have to reframe their ideas to be legible to decision makers in their context. There are probably ways that I would have to reframe some of this work to be kind of legible to AI practitioners and AI researchers. And I am open to thinking about that. If anyone watching is kind of considers himself an AI researcher or practitioner, and feel free to reach out and I'd love to chat. But yeah, I think the AI, I think the kind of concepts of infrastructural speculation and thinking about power and kind of bringing back in ideas of how AI systems can affect people in specific situated contexts is a very useful way forward. Yes, so yeah, I have a question here about, lots of organizations have CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers, who technically work with technical folks. I would argue that they should also probably talk with UX folks as well. I think I'm a little more familiar with this in the realm of privacy, but I think often, it's interesting to see what types of values kind of get allotted, or who gets responsibility for certain types of values within the organization, right? And so often CISOs will have some type of responsibility over security, privacy. Sometimes there's a chief privacy officer or a data protection officer now from the EU. Other times kind of privacy gets housed in a legal department, right? And I think one of the arguments that I'm making in this dissertation is that UX professionals bring in a very useful and slightly different set of viewpoints on issues like privacy and security by understanding how those social values kind of come up in the everyday experiences of people who use technologies. And it does seem like there's a little bit of a gap in connections there between the UX professionals and and some of the chief officers in charge. And so, yeah, I think building bridges kind of in both directions would be really useful. Also, customer service folks, right? Some UX professionals also talked about sometimes talking with the customer service people at their companies who also get kind of direct feedback from users and clients. And they also often have a kind of wealth of information about different types of problems related to these issues. Right. Oh, let's see. A question here about for a little more detail on that kind of GitHub design fiction interface and what makes it problematic about ethics contributions. I think here it's mostly kind of a question of quantifiability, right? The interface makes these like very discrete days, and each day you can have, more like a really dark green means you did a lot of values and ethics work, and a light green means you didn't do as much. And there's like an interesting tension here, because on one hand, I think that would be like a really useful kind of barometer of making visible these practices that are often very invisible. At the same time, how do you quantify that? Like, you might say, okay, I spent this much time, and you say time is what I'm measuring, but is time the right measure? Maybe, maybe not. How do you account for some of these less quantifiable things of when you have to, just the exhaustion that you get from repeating the same thing over and over again in meeting after meeting, or being interrupted and facing microaggressions. So yeah, I think the problematicness there is kind of a larger question of like, if we wanted to make this work visible, how do we make it visible, and like what are the right ways to measure it or compensate for it? So yeah. There's a question here about UX professionals outside of the US. That's a really good question, and I am not sure. Certain countries have stronger human rights, as I think this questioner is kind of alluding to. There are other parts of the world that have stronger kind of human rights commitments, right? Classically, the way that we think about and regulate privacy in the US versus the European Union is very different. So yeah, I think it's quite possible that UX professionals in other parts of the world might situate values differently. Definitely a place for further research. And a couple questions here about the gendered aspects of values work. Is that something we as a field need to learn more about or think more about? I would say yes. Again, at a very small sample size here, but from what I can see, both kind of popular accounts of what's going on, as well as my own research, is that a lot of the people engaged in this work are people who are, have historically been disadvantaged in the tech industry. So, people of color or non-men. And, the fact that the kind of burden of doing this values work is also falling on them, while also facing these kind of intersectional forms of, discrimination and barriers within the tech industry, I think is something that we need to think more about. As there have been kind of these public commitments and statements to increasing diversity and inclusion across tech companies. I think on one hand, there's some skepticism about what that means. On the other hand, I think it does signal that this is something, as a field that we need to learn more about, think more about in aspects of our work, right? So when we think about designing tools for designers to think about values and ethics in their work, we might think about, are the workers we're imagining using these tools vulnerable in different ways? And I don't think that's really a consideration that we often think about when we're developing new values and ethics tools. So yeah, definitely something to consider more. And questions about, forms of collective action. I think there's definitely some of the like traditional, right. A lot of tactics that I described tend to be about individual workers, what my collective action efforts look like in this space. And I think there's a range of things. There's the kind of formal worker organizing, kind of unionization efforts. In some ways, there's also a lot of information sharing and these like communities through these meetup events that are sharing. Right now, when I was attending them, it was like often kind of abstracted case studies talking about, it's interesting because like the secrecy stuff comes to play. So there are these meetup events, tech professionals from different companies come, right? And people give talks about kind of often a case study of how they thought about an issue in a product at their company. But these talks are often given at a like level of abstraction where specific details, perhaps due to NDAs or other forms of corporate secrecy, aren't really discussed. And so, I think that's kind of one issue that needs to be kind of overcome, especially if people are going to be, I think there can be mechanisms for people to share more of this kind of tactical information with each other. And I think, not that design is the solution to everything, but there's potentially an opportunity to do kind of participatory and co-design work to see ways in which design can be useful in kind of facilitating collective action and information sharing. Right. And I think that's it. I would say feel free to send me an email. Things don't, screen's still shared. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out by email. I'm always happy to talk more about these issues, or send me a tweet also.
Thank you, Richmond. I think we all owe you one more very hearty round of applause. Thank you so much for a great talk. And thank you to the audience for a very lively Q&A. I think we all had I feel like it was a great discussion, even though we couldn't all be together in person. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Richmond. And congratulations again on the culmination of your doctoral journey.
Thanks so much, everybody.